Well, good afternoon, evening, everyone, and to everyone online as well. My name is Robin Morris. I'm convener of the Oxford Energy Network. A quick comment on demand-side flexibility, which is taking a slight liberty with our speaker this evening. The electricity system operator is going to be carrying out its second demand flexibility test this evening between 5:30 and 6:30 p.m. It's okay, we're not going to switch lights out or anything, but I thought I would mention that, because there's been a change of focus. This term, we've been really looking at the demand side, but we're going to be talking in our last seminar of the term at the supply side with Tim Stone. Tim, just as a brief introduction, took his degree and DPhil in chemistry just across the way there at Oxford. And his wide-ranging careers included advisory roles from the inception of the Department of Energy and Climate Change, 2007 now, was it?
That's when I started.
Extensive time with KPMG and on the board of the European Investment Bank, just as some examples. Linking to last week's talk as well, Tim is an independent non-executive director on Arab. We had an excellent talk last week from someone there.
Oh, good.
Tim's also currently visiting professor both at UCL's Bartlett School of Architecture, where he teaches master's students on infrastructure and finance, and most recently, Faculty of Engineering at Bristol. Tim has, for several years, been chair of the Nuclear Industry Association and at Nuclear Risk Insurers. With this talk postponed from Trinity term back July time, I think it was, I can't remember. Many may not have predicted some of the changes in the electricity market we've seen in the meantime. Tim promises us a non-partisan examination of the developments from the perspectives of both within and outside Whitehall. So Tim, the floor is yours.
Brilliant, thank you, Robin. And as I've said to some of you before, this is very therapeutic. And I want to say a couple of things by way of introduction. As Robin said, the last time I was in here was making nasty organic chemicals, which stopped me giving blood once the blood donation service realised what I played with. And the other thing I want to say by way of starting is that although I'm talking about nuclear and I've got nuclear jobs, when I worked in Whitehall, I worked across the whole thing. I helped the EIB put financing into renewables, worked on 7 barrage, trying to get that to work, carbon capture and storage. So as far as I'm concerned, there are no silver bullets. What I care about is a sensible energy system that works for the country as a whole. And the reason I'm still doing nuclear is frankly because it's the really hard one. And I haven't quite had the patience to give up yet because it's frankly stupid, but we'll come on to that. I realise there's an audience that I can't see online, so I hope this is, I stay in front of you, you can see what I'm talking about as well as the slides. To the back end of this talk, I'm going to be talking about things that I do not want shared outside this audience, and I need your silent promise that you won't do that, and you'll see why when I come to it. Most of the slides you can have copies of when I finish, but the last bit is particularly sensitive. But I'm including it because I hope it will be helpful in the context of what's going on. So with that by way of background, let's just see which of these various gadgets work. Does that? It does. Right. So that's basically what I'm going to do. I'm going to try and talk about a bit of the context, talk a bit about inescapable obligations at the backdrop of all this. The last real bit is to talk about what Great British Nuclear might be. Not is, because it's not been announced yet, but what it might be. And then a few wrap-up thoughts. And I've got a lot of slides, so I'm going to try and get through them in a sensible amount of time. So some, I don't talk to slides, so you have a look at them and see if they help, but think about them afterwards as well. So we have some whopping challenges. It's been a complete shambles. The energy system has been a complete shambles since really, I suppose, the early 2000s. The regulatory changes at the end of the 90s. And then we can't talk about nuclear, we can do this, we can't do that. A very, very piecemeal approach politically has been just a mess. It's been stop, go, stop, go, stop, go. And as a consequence, the energy industry as a whole views the UK as a high-risk place to do business. Think back to when I first went into Whitehall in end of 2006, 2007. There were 6 big energy companies with big balance sheets. EDF still left. Scottish Power sort of, but that's Iberdrola. SSE a lot smaller. 2 Germans, where have they gone? Nothing. We don't have the balance sheets anymore. The industry's completely changed. And at the same time, the scale of the problems has just been going up dramatically. Why has it taken 15 years to get to where we are now? And it's basically just a complete mess. So if you look through, we went to the coalition government in 2010, and by the way, I don't do politics. So whatever I say, don't treat as any sort of affirmation or condemnation of anybody. Politics is up to them. But by 2008, Labour government had eventually managed to find the political capital to talk about nuclear and said 16 gigs. Then the coalition government came along and a Lib Dem energy minister said, oh yes, but no subsidy for nuclear, no public subsidy. Which of course a phrase like that in Whitehall is capable of interpretation in so many delicate ways that just turns it into a no. In effect, the process we've gone through has been nuts. One of the bits of fun I had was on the board of Horizon, the Hitachi company. I chaired the audit committee, the risk and audit committee. I signed the accounts writing off £2.1 billion. And as an ex-banker, my knees shook when I watched the guys in Tokyo opening bottles of champagne and the market price went up by more than the amount we wrote off. That just shows how really stupid this became in the end and why nobody will ever do that again. So basically, we've not had a sensible, rational approach to any of this thing. We've had stop go, mucking around, no sense of system, no sense of practicality. There's lots of security issues around, which Ukraine, as we'll come on to in a minute, really wound up, but they've been there before. Hurricane Katrina in 2005 ended up where we were almost out of gas beginning in 2006 in the cold weather. And that's what persuaded the then opposition and former Charles Hendry, the energy minister, to realise that energy security actually really mattered. It's all been kind of fine since then. There was a bit of a problem in 2013, but until recently, energy security has just been, it doesn't matter. Well, it's not good enough. Energy today, just look at where we are. Just look at the mix for a start. That little mix around there. That's the nuclear bit of electricity. Look at the mixture. Of all that lot, by 2050, the only bit in there that's low carbon that will still be operating is sizable B. All the rest of it has to be replaced. That's just electricity, all of it. Just imagine the entire electricity network and rebuilding that. And then, let's go on. We've got the rest of it to do. All this lot, 29% of the energy goes down the gas pipe. How are you going to do that? Are you going to replace that with hydrogen? What practically are we going to do with this lot? I'll come on in a minute to add to the number at the top, but I want you to remember the 200 gigawatt number. So that lot together is the equivalent of 200 gigawatts of power 24/7 flat out. Not 200 gigawatts of capacity doing this, but 200 gigawatts doing that. But the physicality of this is vast. The physical challenge, the tons of steel, the number of people to make all this change happen is beyond anything we've seen, and I think probably including the Second World War. It's that big, rebuilding the energy system. Excuse me. So the pace and scale behind all this is off scale. And as an ex-banker, the one thing you learn very quickly is you make money out of volatility, not stability. And you will never see a period of volatility again in your children's lives, like what's going to happen with this. Meanwhile, just look at this, at carbon intensity of different countries, and look at places like California and Netherlands and Germany and France and Ontario and Sweden. Then look down here at Western Australia, Poland, Queensland. And that was our nominal 2030 target for the UK. Just look how far people have to shift, including the UK. So we are there. And the little star is the average. So this is a big, what's the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy phrase? This is vast. It's a really, really big problem. So what's changed recently? And it's essentially energy security. It's around the fact that even with big wind, we've done pretty well in deploying renewables, but we've still got some very unstable prices. Gas is right at the heart of everything, and frankly, the more wind you put up, the more gas you need to balance the wind out when it's not there. The energy crisis last autumn caught people by surprise, so autumn 21. And I remember being at a meeting with some of the BEIS officials and watching them absolutely stunned at the way the gas price had gone like that, which had been foreseen by the markets back in Easter, but doing anything about it took until it actually smacked them in the face. So we've not actually got a control of this because fundamentally the government has outsourced big infrastructure to markets. And it kind of worked from privatization onwards, and we'll come back to that in a minute. But this is what changed. Ukraine changed everything. So as Robin said, I chair a thing called nuclear risk insurance. So guess what we do? One of the places where we insure all the reactors is Ukraine. So the minute the war kicked off, I spent a week with the underwriting team and Lloyd's and the company's guys, with our engineers, talking to the engineers on those sites, telling them, working out what's going on. And then number 10 phoned up and said, the Prime Minister's panicking about energy security. And the net effect of that was a big shift in Whitehall policy, which we'll talk about as we go through. But you've not seen any consistent theme through this. It's been stop, go, another review, bit more legislation, we'll do a few white papers, big chunk in 2008, stop again. No sense of consistency, no sense of direction of travel, essentially a Brownian motion walk around policy in reality. The reality is that in most countries, not all, but in most countries, any balanced system needs nuclear. You don't have any choice. And I'll talk a bit in a bit as well about just where this is going to in terms of international competition. But there are not many places we can do the big ones. We need to do little ones as well. And so the challenge we have now is to think about a nuclear system in an energy system. So after the roundtable with Boris, we produced the energy security strategy and a recognition that we need at least, well, up to is the language, 24 gigs of nuclear by 2050, which will be about a quarter of predicted electricity demand. Approving 8 new reactors by 2030, you can read the rest of the words down there, but actually it was about saying we need to do something. So we created Great British Nuclear as a delivery vehicle, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. A guy called Simon Bowen put in charge of it. Simon's background is an ex-Navy nuke, then went to BP, from there to Urenco, from there to run Babcock Nuclear and the defence business. But he's basically a military guy who you point him in the right direction and get out of the way. So Simon was put in charge of running that, did a really good job. But we have to do something dramatic about how we permit and license infrastructure projects because he's unbelievably slow. Planning inspectorate who were reformed in 2008 have been increasingly bouncing planning applications, not because they should, but because out of fear of, oh, there might be a judicial review. And the net effect of that is that the cost of all this bureaucratic process on us in terms of rebuilding the infrastructure is huge. And I'm not for a minute saying we shouldn't be careful about planning, but we have to think about how we do this and the consequences of how we do it, because the circumstances have changed. But if we're going to do anything, we need to work with other countries, as you will see in a moment, because we have very little left of the nuclear industry in the UK after decades of decline. We have some great operational skills, but we don't have any technology other than Rolls-Royce. We have one. So we have a long way to go to rebuild the system. We need to get from all those existing sites with planning permission, that are agreed under the legislation to build big reactors through to actually building the plants. There's quite a lot of them around to be used in principle, but we need even more. If we're going to put lots of little ones in place as well, small reactors, we need more sites. So there's a challenge to come with that. Where are we going to put them? Just looking around the country, that gives you a bit of a sense of how carbon intensity varies around the country. And one of the things about the top is part of the reason that is all low carbon is because of big nuclear power stations. So COP last year, COP26, almost all the power came from nuclear power stations. It was one of the greenest COPs in terms of energy use around. But just to get the scale of this, remember Theresa May made 2050 and net zero a legal obligation in the UK? 10% of the time. What have we done? What have we done so far? Square root of not very much. The pressure is building. It's building to a point where we can't waste any more time. I want to talk about the money side of this too, not just I'm a banker, but because it does kind of matter in terms of your pensions as well going forward. Let's look at Sizewell. So of the total cost of Sizewell, that's the construction cost, that's the breakdown, that's the civils. But look at the finance cost of Sizewell. It's vast. It's absolutely whopping. That's always been true. Big infrastructure financing is the killer determinant. So for something like Hinkley or Sizewell, for every £1 billion of capex up or down, it changes. If it was the strike price in the Hinkley sense, it changes it, excuse me, 1 billion of capex changes the price by about £8 a megawatt hour. 1 percentage point of cost of capital, 1 percentage point changes it by 13. So if you go from 8% of cost of finance down to 7%, it's 13 quid off the electricity price. It's hugely sensitive. So any unnecessary margin on that cost of capital is an artificial tax on energy price for the country as a whole. That's the bit that's taken a long time to sink in. Here's an example. These are numbers from EDF, and that's the electricity price down the left-hand side. That's the cost of capital on the bottom. So if you end up with a cost of capital somewhere around 4%-ish, look at the electricity price. That's how sensitive it is. So that's why there's been a big push to change the whole financing, because Hinkley is about that. It's not exactly linear, but it's close enough for these purposes to draw a sort of straight line. Cost reduction, if you build fleets, as we did with wind and solar, the cost comes down because you do it again and you make it smarter. So we have to get from the point where we are cranking through and we bring those economies of scale. But even so, if you look at the breakdown of the strike price for Hinkley, it's not sensible. We've got to do something about driving down the cost of build and the cost of finance. Now, for SMRs, the challenges are different. First of all, back to my point about utility companies, there's nobody got the balance sheet or the bottle to take on the ability, the client integrator role. People want to buy product. People want things that just work. They don't want to buy lots of bits and have to glue them together. We used to do that in the days of CGB, and we were really good at it, but there's nobody left like that. So the nearer they are to product, as in you literally open a catalogue, and I'm on one of those here, the easier it is for the financing community in particular to do this. And that's where the SMRs are going. And roles in particular have shifted to the idea that they're building small modular power stations. So the last line on that bullet point, I gave a speech in 2016 to the SMR community, and I said, when I worked in New York, I used to finance aeroplanes. I didn't finance engines because engines don't generate revenue. Aeroplanes do with engines on them. Power stations with reactors in them generate revenue. And at the end of the day, all the nuclear reactors anyway is a kettle. It just boils water. It doesn't generate any electricity. You have to do other things with it. So we need a different challenge altogether. And the sooner we get to the idea of small modular power stations where big boxes appear on site and are bolted together and wired together, done, the better. I mean, why not? Why not? Glaxo, and I think one other pharma company, and I'm not sure how public this is, so please be careful what you do with it, but at least one of them has a deal with an engineering firm where they have modularized a pharmaceutical plant. And the pharma company says, I want one that will do a ton a year at this location. And what arrives at that location is a series of 40-foot containers with numbers on the outside from 1 to N. And you open the back door of number 1, and on the 2 doors are pretty pictures of how to assemble the color-coded components inside. You need a small crane, a cherry picker, and a bunch of people with spanners and sockets, but not much more than that. All the clever stuff being done in the factory. If you do that for a pharmaceutical factory, why can't we do it for this? Why can't they all do it for this? And it's frankly, we've had the wrong sort of nuclear engineer being far too geeky and far too clever for far too long, and not industrial designers thinking about how to build these things massively at scale. And my second point on here is really important. You can parallelize, if there is such a word. And if there isn't, can you guys help me with a different word? But you can parallelize a lot in factories, but you can't parallelize work on site. It's single thread. So you've got to get the work on site rammed down to the shortest possible time, which means the most done in the factory and then bolted together on site. So we need to get to a stage where you can assemble these things on a site in 2 years or less. At that point, you're in business in a different world. So I want to come back to the other part of my title, which is the Inescapable Obligations, and what you can draw from this, because some of this is just a bit scary, I think. So if you think about the way that we create infrastructure in the UK, it's a mixed economy. Some of it's public, some of it's privatised, but ultimately, in all cases, it comes back to the state, whether it's through a regulator or a commissioning body or some spending control or something like that. That's inevitable, because big infrastructure is inevitably a sovereign risk. Doesn't matter what you do with it. If it goes wrong, doesn't matter what the contracts say. As far as we're all concerned, it's the government's fault. So if we get to January and February this year and it's really cold and the lights go out, we aren't going to turn around to Bulb and Octopus or whoever it is and say, what have you guys done? We'll turn around to the government. We'll all turn around to the government and say, you so-and-so, what have you been doing for the last 20 years? Why have our lights gone out? Government owns failure in national infrastructure. And it's quite interesting. If anybody is interested in this, this is a research paper from the Conservative Research Department in 1977. And it was done by a guy who became an MP called Nick Ridley. And it was essentially the theology of how to privatise, what should be privatised, and so on. And it's really, honestly, really good, thorough piece of work. However, you can't read it on here. I'm going to have to squint, but let me just read you a little bit of it, because it says, the next phase should be to break up the industries into smaller units. The reasons for doing it are blah, blah, blah. The scope for fragmenting industry varies from industry to industry. It is greatest for Group A: coal, shipbuilding, docks, airports, motor car manufacturing. Ooh, remember we used to own them? Buses and freight. It is intermediate for airways, steel, aircraft, nuclear fuel, interesting, cable and wireless. It is minimal, and these are the true utilities, in gas, electricity, railways, water, posts, telephones and underground railways. Guess what we privatised? Completely backwards, completely back to front. So even the good thinking doesn't always make it through. And actually that paper's in the Fitzwilliam archives. It's Margaret Thatcher archive there. You can find it on the net. And it's just a hoot all the way through, as in you can't make it up. So it's really good. But this is my point. The simple truths are government owns failure. And it doesn't matter what your contract says. Force majeure means that ultimately you can't outsource failure. And the first time I had to drum that into Whitehall was when we were looking at, I was originally brought in to sort out waste and decommissioning financing for new nuclear. And I said to the guys, we are going to have to set a price at which we take the waste. The official said, oh, we can't do that because until we built a repository, we don't know what it's going to cost. I said, let me turn it around. Imagine you're now a nuclear operator and you say to us, and you're daft enough to say, don't worry, I'll pay whatever it takes. And in 80 years' time, when government's made a Horlicks of building the repositories they usually do, and the price has gone through the roof, and they say to you, look, I know we sort of talked about 20 quid, but actually it's about 100. You get the keys back. There's an L in PLC for a reason. You cannot outsource failure to the private sector. It doesn't work. And if you try it and get away with it once, you won't do it twice. Witness Hitachi 2.1 billion write-off. And so fundamentally, resilience has to be right at the heart of government policy making. Otherwise, we all suffer fundamentally. And we have skinnied down our energy system to the point where it's not resilient. It is not fit for purpose and hasn't been there for too long. So I want to do a little experiment. So when I worked over there, my supervisor actually drilled something into me quite early on. So we used to take pictures of spectra on photographic plates the old-fashioned way, but then spend days measuring these damn things on a travelling microscope, for those who know what it is. But before we did, Dickie would say, measure it with a notch stick first. Of course, if it doesn't look right with a notch stick, it won't be right when you measure it accurately. So this is my attempt at a notch stick on the energy system. So forgive me for the simplification, but at the moment, total energy usage, I think 2021, works out as the equivalent of 200 gigawatts, 24/7 flat. There's no bouncing up and down, that's 200 gigawatts flat. So let's just have a little thought experiment as to where we might make that primary energy. Now, let us assume for a minute, back to my earlier diagram, that about a third-ish of the energy goes down a gas pipe, because if it doesn't, you have to put some copper bus bars down streets. So let's assume a third goes down a gas pipe. So let's assume we can make 60 gigawatts of hydrogen from methane, steam reformed, and buried CO2. So that's one way of doing it. So let's just assume that. Then let's take the next two numbers out of the last Blaze White paper, 120 gigs of solar and wind. That's a very generous capital efficiency factor for wind. That's pretty generous for solar. But if you have 120 of those, you get 18 real, 60 actual. And if you add those up, you then need 62 gigs of nuclear, which is a 92% capacity factor, is 67 gigs. Yes.
Six. today we've got 4.6 gigawatts of nuclear and we've been exporting to France. So I do question your 0.92.
No, 0.92 is what modern plants, modern new build plants generate. Modern new build plants in the US, in Abu Dhabi, in Korea, in China, in Japan, running at about somewhere between 90 and 94%. Plenty of data for that, plenty of hard practical data. And so, as I said, I was regional advisor on Abu Dhabi. They're running at about 92% on the first unit already. So you can do it. I completely agree. If you look historically, the old AGRs haven't done that, and you've got somebody who sits two away from you who's run some of these plants. But modern plants run at over 90%.
On the same thing, wind is 0.3 at the moment, average.
Yeah.
Solar is 0.1.
Yeah. So I started being generous. That's generous for big offshore wind.
Oh, yeah.
Big offshore wind, probably 40–45%. But I'm trying to be helpful here. So, but it's that sort of order. That's really good solar in the UK. You know, I don't go to Blackpool to get a suntan. I go to the south of France. But those are generous numbers. This is not meant to be a prediction. This is not my script. It's just trying to get the scale of the problem. And just to put this in context as well, that 120 of offshore wind, that's about another 100. So just bear with me. The biggest wind turbine today is 14 megawatts. It's made by Hitachi. GE Hitachi. If you assume a 20 megawatt turbine, that's pretty big. The 14 megawatt turbine is the height of the Eiffel Tower. It needs about a 20,000-ish ton floating platform to sit on. You need to build 200 of those every year from now to 2050. Where are you going to build 200 small oil rigs every year? That number there, solar, that's equivalent to about 1,000 square miles, stick end. So I'm not getting it. So as far, these all matter, but it's the physical practicalities of every single one of those. Where do I make 200 floating platforms a year around the British coast? Which estuaries, which port? We've never done 10. Where do I find 1,000 square miles? How on earth do I build all that? Let alone, how do I get 60 gigawatts of hydrogen out of methane? So all of this lot, remember, I've assumed that 200 gigawatts stays put. So if energy demand drops materially, at least you've got some resilience built in to deal with that. And a bit of storage to go with it. So the point I want you to remember from this is not that these numbers are predictions, but they are all big. Whatever you do, it's a really big challenge. And actually, if you want to see some interesting models to go with this, apart from David Mackay's book, the carbonfreeeurope.org website has some very interesting system modeling for Western Europe. They put a fair amount of effort and time into it. It's the first attempt at a proper system model I'm aware of. It's bad to be wrong, but it gives you sort of fag packet numbers to get a sense of the scale of what interconnect demands might be, how much hydrogen you need in different places. It's not completely physically bounded in terms of how many tons of steel can you make, but it's the first attempt. But have a look. So we have a big battle, and the thing in the middle there is we do not have a system model for the UK. We've got lots of bits stuck together with elastic. It is not a proper system model that anybody is about to invest any serious money in the long term, other than the opportunistic stuff.
Yeah, just to add another row, really. What about storage?
Storage isn't primary energy source. This is where's the energy come from? I completely agree. You have storage in there to balance it all out.
And also carbon capture and storage.
Yeah, but CCS isn't energy. So you need the CCS capacity for the hydrogen from the methane. This is simply where's the energy coming from? Where's it coming from? Then all the stuff that goes with that is additional work. I agree, but where's it going to come from in the first place? You can't store it until you've made it. So where's it coming from? Which is why I said it's a notch stick right up here. Simplistic analysis, but it's a scale thing. It's how many zeros and what's the first digit really that matters. So I want to come on to regulation and the failures there, and this is not getting at regulators, it's actually getting at the system in which they operate. So it was there, we were having a conversation earlier, it was originally created to solve a different problem in the 1980s. The original idea itself was a stopgap. It was never meant to survive in the long term. So there's your quote for Stephen Littlechild saying, actually, it wasn't meant to survive. It's completely anachronistic because the context in which this was all created in the first place has completely changed. But we've not touched the duties of regulators because people are terrified of frightening the markets by changing regulators' duties. because we're trying to make the regulators independent and trustworthy for markets, but you've got to keep them current and relevant. So Ofwat did not have a duty of resilience when I was on the board of Anglian Water. And so we're saying, East Anglia, part of it's like a desert. We have lower rainfall in Lowestoft than Beirut. We need more storage. We need more reservoirs. We need to reduce leakage. Oh, no, you can't reduce leakage below an economic level of leakage. Duties need updating, and there is no system anywhere in Whitehall for materially updating regulators' duties. The Better Regulation Executive spends their time worrying about how different industries calculate the weighted average cost of capital for their industry. That's where they spend their focus, not on the duties. So, given the pace and scale and change, we have to do something very different. And embedding resilience in there, and as I was saying earlier, we've got to do it in a way that the markets will trust, because money is very, very volatile, as we saw with the mini budget earlier on this year. Lots of common failures here. So if you think about, for example, the Bank of England is trying to drive inflation down. What are they actually going to do about energy prices? What's the Bank of England do about energy prices, which is the biggest driver of inflation? Answer, nothing. What's Ofgem going to do about overall energy prices when all they do is they regulate transmission and distribution and the retail bit? They can do virtually nothing to make a real difference. They can tweak at the edges, and it's important that they do. But we don't actually have regulators who are in control in the way that the public think they are. The public thinks Ofgem should control energy prices. So my thesis as an ex-Wall Street banker is that markets as Darwinian evolutionary mechanisms just are inappropriate for heavy infrastructure. And actually going forwards, what's a market there for? Because it can't be about forward cost discovery, because we don't have time for that. It's about maximizing gigawatts a year of new build with price per megawatt hour as a constraint. It's a different model altogether. And actually, when you look at the imperfect information we have to play with on this, and assets versus liability, we don't actually have control. You can't do this in a market mechanism. And frankly, that last point on this side, nobody in Treasury sits there with a list of national infrastructure and the remaining useful life in that infrastructure, at which point they should be doing stuff. Because if, to quote Donald Trump, we're testing too much. If you measure it too much, you don't like what you find. Right, and meanwhile, corporate memory gone out the window. There's nobody around in Whitehall now who knows how to build a garden shed even with instructions, because that's not what we recruited for. We've recruited for to solve different problems. So we have a big issue. I think we're going to get industrial policy and industrial strategy back again under Grant Shapps. But, I know, Roger was saying earlier, infrastructure decays glacially slowly. You don't notice it. You just don't know it. And Joni Mitchell, I think, Norman, Joni Mitchell song, The Big Yellow Taxi. You don't know what you've got till it's gone. And that's exactly what's happened. The infrastructure around us, whether it's roads, railways, energy, water, it's just been doing that post-privatisation because we've not been putting investment in it because we haven't had to. I'll leave these for you to look at offline, but basically if you look at some basic ideal measures of markets, what makes a good market, and then does it work for infrastructure? The answer is basically no, it doesn't. It's not. It's just not a market. It never was. But it's a system. Infrastructure is a system, and some of you in this room know what that means in terms of this diagram. So that is a basic engineer's control loop for controlling stable systems. It's a feedback loop. And actually that works. The whole PFI P3 basis was using that as its underlying logic. But infrastructure is inherently a system. You have to think about, if you're replacing a tiny little bit, it doesn't matter. If you take a big chunk out, it really, really does, because the rest of the system relies on it being there to interact and cooperate and interact in a stable way. And systems thinking is just nowhere in Whitehall. Odd bods, but not really there embedded. And in the absence of that evolutionary Darwinian process, you've got to plan it. You're going to, for the pace and scale of what we need, you've got to have some sort of plan based on what we know is true today, with off-ramps if we discover. So if it turns out in 5 years' time that somebody cracked fusion, whoopee, it's an off-ramp. But right now, if we're going to get to 2050, you can't wait for that. You simply cannot wait any longer. That was the attitude for the whole of the last decade. There'll be something come around the corner that sorts it. But those interdependencies are really complicated. And frankly, you've got to have a guiding mind at the top of it. Otherwise, it won't work as a plan. And it's interesting how other countries are picking that one up. So as a system, you've got to think about the way the limits to markets get in the way of this, and the practicalities of designing that system all essentially fold around how fast you can change things, how fast you can grow the supply chain for people, because that kind of matters too. So this is a little pretty picture of how an energy policy systems thinking might evolve. So you've got a bit that thinks about security of supply, you've got another bit that thinks about resilience and sustainability, and another bit that thinks about the cost of the economy, and the guiding mind has to sit right there smack in the middle of those three and balance those three in terms of the design. But you cannot sit back and just let it happen, because trust me, as an ex-banker, somebody will have you for breakfast, because that pace and scale of change, people will make out like bandits and they'll catch you in the absence of some form of central coordination. And, you know, there's a banker saying this. So I'm not some hard left-wing Marxist, you know, quite the opposite in terms of market theology. Now, this is the bit where I need all of you to promise me that what I tell you here, you will keep to yourselves for the time being, because this is to take any questions you like, either here now or later in private.
Thank you very much indeed, too. We'll take the chair's prerogative 1 second. You used France as an example there, and we know they're in a bit of trouble at the moment.
Yeah.
I'm going to ask you a slightly separate question, which is, you've got some exposure to circumstances of drought, for example, but perhaps the question I would ask is, how many reactor design types would you use? Because if you choose one and there's a flaw in it, you're scuppered. So what's an optimal number of design types for reactors? So
there's two issues. One is for gigawatt scale, I'd have 2, because you're not going to build that many of them, because there aren't that many sites where you can put them. For smaller ones, I'd have 3. Not just because of diversity and eggs in baskets risk, which is because if you go back to 2008, that's exactly what we said then in the white papers, that we wanted 2 or 3 of each to avoid eggs in baskets, to operate as a fleet in the first place, so that when you do change anything, you change the fleet as a whole in an organised and disciplined way, and you learn how to operate. For the small ones, you do need 3, I think, because the sheer pace and scale of what you have to do, just running on 1 or 2 isn't enough. And actually for Rolls, I mean, Rolls have got really good design. I quite like them to be exporting abroad as well, so I don't want them doing nothing for the UK. I'd like them to build some higher value from foreign countries, but you need to build a fleet in a systemic way. And you're right, because in France, you know, it's a single point of failure, single design. What they've had to do is update the whole lot of them. And again, this is partly in turn back to making sure that the organisation is sensibly funded. You need to make sure that the repairs are done, the maintenance is done when it needs done, not when you absolutely have to do it. And it's, you know, we all know that from cars. You don't wait until the thing breaks down. The minute the light starts flashing, you get something done about it. And governments have historically not been that good at making sure things are done on time, because then you get into public expenditure and government balance sheets and all this sort of stuff. And actually, this is kind of too important for that.
So questions from the floor, gentleman at the front.
Do you also not need for net zero something like GBN for wind, solar, you know, CCS, you know, shutting down the livestock industry, livestock farming, steel, cement industries to be shut down, aviation to be shut down?
Right. So on wind, I think it's pretty much okay now. I think it's got there out of making, frankly, an awful lot of money in the early stages, that there's a process that people recognise. I worry a bit about the sheer scale and the practicality of some of the big offshore wind aspirations that are there, in terms of, as I was saying, how on earth do you build all those floating platforms? You know, if it's 20,000+ tons of steel and 19 gigawatt hours of power, you know, that is mind-boggling stuff. Where's the steel coming from? Back to your point. And this is back to the industrial strategy point. Government doesn't have to own any of these industries, but they have to make sure that the ones that matter are still around. So let me give you a dull, boring example from, I'm a Sheffield lad. There's a thing called Sheffield Forge Masters, and they are one of the best forging companies on this earth. They taught Japan Steelworks how to do it. They taught the Koreans how to do it. They've been teaching Barrett Forge in India how to do it. They can take a 300-ton ingot, cook it, smack it with a big press, and over a few weeks turn it into a pressure vessel for a Rolls-Royce submarine. They can take another one and smack it into a really long big tube. They basically turn it, bang it until it's round, stand it on its end, punch a hole through the middle, and then keep banging it. It gets longer and longer and longer and longer. And eventually that thing becomes a pipe mould for Saint-Gobain in France, who produce continuously casted high pressure gas pipes by pouring steel on the top, spinning this thing around. They can do magic. It's all done by artisans. You can't AI this. This is all by eye, and it takes about 5 years to get to the point where you know how to do this. Those sort of industries have to be looked after. It basically went effectively bust before Rolls-Royce and BAE and the MOD bought it and saved it.
But this has to be done in a carbon neutral way, though.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. This is a huge challenge. You know, if we're going to make steel in a low carbon way with hydrogen, great, but who's going to make that happen? Because right now, the guys who own the steel companies certainly aren't going to do it. What are you going to do about cement? How are you going to make low carbon cement? How are you going to make low carbon glass, etc.? This is a fundamental shift. And all I'm talking about is one little bit, which is where the energy is coming from to help the rest of it. But the transitions are not going to happen by Darwinian evolution and, oh, let's try a bit, let's play. It needs much more drive than that, otherwise it will not happen in time. And the risk we run is that somebody else will get a better process, and the ones that we want to come here and work here will go there. So we are competing.
So is SMS already licensed, or how long is it? And also the supplementary question. I know it depends very much on confidence and market rate. Is their strike price, do they think, if they're making not the first of the kind, but let's say the fifth?
Yeah, the asking vote. It's in licensing at the moment. It's probably going to take them 3 to 4 years to get through that. Principally because it's a completely brand spanking new design. It's not a submarine reactor that's been painted pink and bent a bit. It's a brand new design. So they don't have a reference plant that they can say, here's one that's pretty close to it.
Basically a pressurized water reactor.
It's PWR. Yep. Yeah. So it's and it's a very elegant design. It's very clever. It's relatively simple. There's lots of good things about it. It has to go through that. In terms of the electricity price that they want out of it, they're saying somewhere in the order of 60 to 80 pounds, somewhere around there for the earlier ones, and maybe down a bit. The fundamental issue is things like the reason why reactors got bigger is because there's an element of fixed cost. And so what is now the Westinghouse AP1000 started life as an AP600, and they made it bigger to spread the fixed costs and your price down. So what you have to do with the smaller ones is do them differently. So can you, for example, have a much smaller exclusion zone on a modern, safer reactor? So that changes fixed price. So it's going to be fundamentally about the very significant savings in stick build construction on site versus manufacturing, both in terms of speed and quality and cost. And then also physical site characteristics. So there's going to be quite a learning curve for all the SMRs, wherever they are, as to who gets down the curve fastest and furthest. And so part of the reason why I'd quite like 3 is just to see what happens. Because in the end, I actually don't care precisely about the electricity price out of one particular unit. What I do care about is the cost of electricity overall, overall, in terms of cost to the national economy. That's what matters. Not how the individual bits are made up. Some will be more expensive, some less expensive, but it's the system as a whole, the cost of that really matters. But there's plenty of reason to think that properly built SMRs will be a bit cheaper than the big ones, because they're built differently, they're manufactured in a different way, rather than stick built construction, bit by bit, bolt by bolt. But I don't know what the answer is. I suspect it'll be better, but I'm not taking any bets until I see a bit more work. And I'm being honest.
So with the GBN thing, you have this part where you hand it over to the operator.
So at the end of the day, there'll be an operator who runs these things. It's a question as to whether the operator becomes part of Great British Nuclear. It could be, could well be. Why not?
Then, so they would be reaping basically the profits after.
No. So operation is actually running the unit. Doesn't mean you necessarily own it.
Okay.
So, there are plenty of operators of facilities, not nuclear facilities, who are just operating on a contract basis. And in fact, Exelon, the Chicago-based nuclear organization, is looking to operate on a contract basis for other countries. So it's just literally about the operation. Ownership is an entirely different issue.
Sarah, I'll come to you in 1 second, but my one question is you're trying to concentrate some political decisions. My slight concern is there's a lot of churn in the civil service where as soon as someone's learned enough about something to be dangerous, they move on. So how do we build any kind of capacity for thinking inside the decision-making apparatus that is government?
So this is a systemic issue across Whitehall. It's not just energy, because we're now in a realm where so much of what we have to do is about physical constraints. It's about how many people, how many tons of steel, where's the steel coming from, how do the markets work actually, and having people inside Whitehall who think, like a banker. Because without that, you can have very interesting intellectual analyses. And if your pace and scale of change is tiny, the odds are you're not going to make any difference. But when it's a big pace and scale of change, you are going to get it wrong. And you will be gained by the markets. So there is an issue as to how we both build and maintain skills. So when we put the Great British Nuclear team together, the person who ran the siting process used to run the Office for Nuclear Development and ran the siting process last time round. And he is one of the guys who worked in the Department of Energy in the first place. So it's got real corporate memory. The guy running tech selection used to run the Navy nuclear submarines. So the guy who knows an awful lot about the technical side of stuff. So the knowledge is important. It's how we take those people and we create a supply chain for officials inside GBN who know how to do this. So this apprenticeship process is really important because there's nothing like enough people. I think, across the infrastructure sector as a whole, so this is, HS2 and stuff like that, there are thousands and thousands of engineers missing today. And that's before we start doing any of this at scale. So for the nuclear sector, we've currently got about 64,000 direct jobs and about another the same again indirect jobs. If you get this sort of thing up to building up to 24 gigawatts, you're probably going to have around 110,000 fully employed people. But you've got to build that. And we've got to build that against face competition. So this is a systemic issue about how do we keep and maintain skills within the industry, within the public sector more broadly. Because otherwise we're going to be had for breakfast and we will lose people to abroad.
Sarah, do you still have a question?
It's about, it's arguably, I would think, the most inescapable obligations, which is the obligation to deal with the waste. And which is on some hectic timescales. And again, Ukraine, in terms of security too, is very instructive at the moment. And quite horrifying by so the latest estimate, I think, for decommissioning is close to 150 billion for 140 years. And on past experience, that figure is going to rise. So it's going to be a big item. I wondered how that fitted in with the Great British Nuclear planning and how that's.
Okay. It's a really important question. So let's start with waste itself and what it is. First of all, it's solid. It's not going anywhere. For the modern reactors, if all the energy used in your life came from nuclear reactors, from modern nuclear reactors, the high level waste from that will fit the shot glass. So let's get the scale there. The issue of dealing with it, you know exactly what to do it. The Finns have an operational repository. The Swedes are building theirs. We went about it in a completely stupid way. What the Finns did was they said, and when they started nuclear power in the 80s, they said, we're not going to start nuclear power until we have plans to build a repository. So the two started in parallel. What they did was they went to communities and they said, we want to build a repository. This is what it looks like. It's a corkscrew shaft that goes down into some horizontal tunnels with galleries out sideways. And the corkscrew shaft is so you can't drop anything. and it goes down at a gradual pace. When we build one of these things, here's the benefits that come to community. Communities, please bid. What we said was, we've got a problem, we've got to dump some rubbish. Who wants to take it? I'm exaggerating slightly for effect. So guess what? Community said, not clear, thank you very much. And we have.
Sorry, I'm asking though,
Yeah.
what a great British nuclear.
So GBN is about building new stuff. The NDA is currently dealing with the existing waste and building the repository. In terms of the safety and security of that waste, it is massively safer than what we do currently with CO2. I mean, just massively. But are we doing something? Yes. So there are now 4 communities who are now in the process for accepting a repository to be built there. Right now, the waste, so most of the waste at Sellafield comes back from historical production where nobody gave us stuff, frankly, about the consequences, whether it was because of Cold War or miners' strikes. So there's cleaning up going on at Sellafield. The numbers in terms of billions, frankly, I haven't got a clue. Those estimates, it might be 140 something. They're units of account, whether they're pounds or dollars or yen or euros, I have no idea, nor has anybody else. Because until we've actually started to deal with this properly on a timely basis, you don't know what it's going to cost. What I do know is that by spreading the thing out, it costs far too much because of the hotel costs of looking after it. And in fact, if you look at the economic analysis that Whitehall did on this, it was basically a big NPV. And the longer you spread out the spend, the lower the net present value. And when you eventually do it in infinity, it costs 0. And that's kind of the mentality we've been behind this. It's been pushing it out. And one of the phrases I was going to use and forgot is that we are actually dealing with very long wavelength problems with very short wavelength policies. And so the issue of dealing with a repository has been pushed out and pushed out and pushed out and has not been gripped. Other countries have and are showing how to do it. We need to get on with this. And in terms of the safety, once it's down there, I'm happy to have a conversation offline with this in terms of just hard facts. And I promise I've not got an axe to grind on this. It's just about the hard scientific facts. But let me just give you a couple of numbers about waste. First of all, the worst ice age we've had went down about 150 metres. Any repository is going to be at least 200, probably near 1,000 metres deep. Once it's down there, it stays like dinosaur skeletons. They don't come out very easily. To get stuff out of the ground 1,000 metres down costs shed loads, as the oil and gas industry knows. So once it's down there out of the way, first of all, it's not going anywhere. Second, in terms of risks, once it's encapsulated, you're dealing with anything that's particularly nasty is inside glass and it's insoluble metal oxides. So even if water got through all the barriers, the leaching rate is way, way, way below background. So what we forget in all this is that there's a background level of radiation, which we all live with and doesn't have any effect on us. And the United Nations are completely clear that under 100 millisieverts, you don't get any health effects. And indeed, there's actually some very strong biological evidence that very low level dose of radiation is actually good for you, which is definitely another conversation to be had offline. But dealing with the waste is something that we all have to do. And we haven't dealt with the waste with CO2, and we're not going to deal with the waste with CO2. But at least with nuclear waste, we know where it is, we know how to deal with it, and once it's dealt with underground, it's not going anywhere. Compare and contrast to decommissioning big wind turbines, where you've got the massive amounts of glass fibre, which just goes in landfill and sits there for millennia doing nothing, or the solar cells, where you've got horrible heavy metals to deal with. And we need to think systemically about the whole lot. And none of these things come without some effort and some thought and some care. And waste is always the one that people worry about. But it's quite easy to worry about nuclear waste because we don't play with this stuff. So as a kid, and I'll explain what I mean. As a kid in A-level physics, we got cobalt-60 sources out and measured them with Geiger counters and stuck bits of foil and paper in the way. And when the teacher wasn't looking, I put my hand in the way to see what happens. And it's not dropped off yet. But there's a real fear factor around nuclear waste, which we have to confront and understand the real science behind it. But I completely agree with you. We need to get on with it. And it's one of the things that we will do. So GBN won't be doing it. Yeah.
Waste could go into the ground underneath. How long do you think it's going to take to make that happen? And how is Sellafield going to be detoxified? And how's all that going to be? values. It clearly this is a long complex task. I mean, sorry, I don't want to
no,
know the whole
fine.
thing about this. I'm just saying
Fine.
that I think.
So let me just deal with the waste one. If people wanted to do it, you could have the repository up and working in certainly 50 years. If you wanted to do it.
50.
50. No, 50 if they wanted to, you could have it done in 50.
Right.
There's no reason to rush before that because you don't put any of the spent fuel, sorry, once you've fueled that. No. So I've sat on top of all the high level waste in the country and make my day, go try and do something with it. It's very secure. It is genuinely very secure. My company insures Chernobyl, never mind Zaporizhia, we insure that one too, until very recently. So understanding the risks, we've been through this in immense detail. To do the sort of damage you were talking about with the big power stations takes some huge explosions. Zaporizhia is not something that's going to be taken apart by a small missile. You might stop it working.
I'm thinking of the cooling.
Yeah, but the cooling ponds, what are you worried about the cooling ponds? They're just ponds of water that you keep circulating. You can run them with diesel generators. So let's have a conversation offline because this is, if in terms of risks to all of us, we are at greater risk of our phone system, our power system, our water system being interrupted by cyber. That's what we should really be worried about. And if we're looking at national risks, the risks to our civil society are not from nuclear waste. They're definitely not from nuclear waste.
That's another question. Sizewell is the same design as the same.
Yes.
Okay. So we really need clean power very quick. So why isn't it best just to keep going with it? Because the nuclear industry has been the devil, as you said, design. This one hopefully will be made quicker.
Yep.
You've got a workforce now at long last that knows how to do it. But now you're recommending a completely new pack.
I'm doing that. Hinkley, Sizewell, Wilver, another one. So staggering them through. So Wilver, so the point about Wilver is a second design, a proven design, the one that's being finished in Whitehall right now. The Chinese have got 4 of them running. There's 5 back runs in the States, 6 on shortly after. Proven design, do the same thing again like Abu Dhabi did.
So what I'm really saying is why not just keep doing large ones?
2, we want 2 in parallel to avoid
so 2 large ones.
Yeah.
In parallel. Yeah.
2 large ones in parallel, and then probably 2 little ones in parallel as well to start with, and maybe a third
that's
in due
what I'm
course.
not too sure about, because actually the nuclear industry have a awfully bad track record to talk about, and actually we need this quickly.
Right.
And so
Which is exactly why the guy doing all the work on Great British Nuclear on how to do this from a project point of view was the bloke who built Abu Dhabi on time and on budget, and a whole load of can-dos around the world before that. The trick to building them on time and on budget is actually nothing to do with nuclear. It's really dull, boring, simple project management. Really simple. So, as I said, as a banker, I used to do big projects. I was one of the guys behind what's now known as HS1. That Channel Tunnel rail link was built on time and on budget.
so basically these small ones are more cost effective.
They should be. They should be. They should be. And that's why also doing the gigawatt 1 scales first to get some progress going through takes away a little bit of time pressure to make sure that we know that the SMRs will be cost effective when we start building them. So it's about a programmatic approach to it. And if we were doing this a decade ago, we could have a different conversation. That's the problem. We're at least a decade late in gripping this.
I'm going to suggest we bring the formal questions to an end, Chair, if that's all right. First of all, thank Tim again once more. Quick notice just to say next week's seminar from John Barrett has been postponed until the 24th of January. But next Tuesday, the Oxford Martin School is running an event on solar fuels, hosting Aldous Steinfeld from ETH Zurich. But you will need to register if you want to go to that. And shortly we'll be posting details of seminars for the next term. But thanks for people online and thanks again to Tim.
Thank you. Thank you for the therapy.
Yeah, that's right.